This video was made possible with the help of Elevation Science, who strive to inspire people to explore and engage with our planet by creating educational experiences in paleontology, natural history, and scientific research. And by you. When you give on Patreon, check out our store, or just subscribe, it really, really helps out. Thank you. So, some months ago, Miss Liz got these fossil crate toys and showed them to me, and I have no memory of this happening, but apparently I did that thing where I said, you know, historically, they really did just ship crates of bones back east in train cars or in wagons, and sometimes it was just a sack of bones and dirt, and she got that look where she was like, we could film this. So then she went and did a bunch of research and found out a bunch of stuff I didn't know about the history of this practice. You see, for as long as we've been working with fossils, we have had a problem. How do you get these fragile, heavy things from where you dug them up to where you're going to do paleontology to them without arriving in more pieces than you got them out of the ground in? The solution is to add what's called a jacket to keep the rock and bone all nice and neat and together. So this is the history of fossil jacketing. Caveat, this video is going to be pretty North America-centric. Paleontology obviously is a global scientific tradition, but our sources are pretty limited before the first big American dinosaur rush, which is the period that the aesthetic of these toys is mimicking. You know, going out into the frontier and coming back with, you know, kind of battered and... Wait, are these claw marks? Why are there claw marks? There's not tigers. Anyway, having to bring your stuff back to the lab for study is evoking this like Wild West aesthetic here. We do have some documentary evidence of like how early English paleontologists were digging up fossils. I hesitate to even use the word paleontologist for this, but they did not write down their methods, particularly with regard to like how they got the bones back to where they were going to work on them. For that kind of information, we really need to go to the 19th century. In 1836, de la Beche advised some things that we're going to hear echoes of right down to the modern day. He said you need to leave the matrix, the rock and dirt that's around the bone, intact. You need to record information about the site as you excavate it so that you know what came from where. And he even suggested using Plaster of Paris to keep everything secured together. In 1863, an English worker called Davies had to transport a mammoth skull, and he wrapped the whole thing in a layer of plaster and something called whitey brown paper, reinforced with bent iron bars. He wrapped that whole mass in canvas, cord, and hay, just really trying to secure everything so that it wouldn't fall apart, and then sawed it into pieces, took the tusks off because he needed manageable chunks to be able to move them. And he was only going like 15 kilometers. These Europeans were engaged in, you know, gentlemanly excursions to retrieve fossils, what we would call hobbyist or commercial collection, though they did also have, you know, industrial or military digs would occasionally turn up a bone. The point is, they were relatively close to population centers, whereas in America, we have systemic logistical problems trying to transport material 2 orders of magnitude longer of distances. It really wasn't until after the American Civil War that our network of canals and especially railroads opened up the west of the continent to East Coast naturalists, or the collectors who were working for them. which is how we got the first great American dinosaur rush, also called the Jurassic Dinosaur Rush, also called the Bone Wars, which we really do intend to make a video about at some point, but in brief. Western North America has these rock formations, most famously Morrison from the Jurassic, which were yielding the remains of these giant animals. And if you describe the bones of these giants, you get your name in the papers. And paleontology at this time was still a gentlemanly pursuit, so prestige was everything. This led to a couple of workers, Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope, getting unreasonably competitive about it. They were actually turning in pretty bad science. They were more interested in describing as many species as possible, getting their name into the scientific record, rather than, being careful about what they were doing. And you might ask, well, why would there be a rivalry? There's surely plenty of taxa to go around. Like, even today, with a way bigger field of paleontology, we're not in any danger of running out of fossils. Partially, it was the mineral rush air of the period. This is the time when we would have gold rushes and so forth. Partially, it was the practical constraint that there's only so many bones you can get out of the ground in a season. You see, sane people only have a few months out of the year to search and excavate these sites before they have to rebury them for the winter. Some have physical or environmental hazards, or even threats of violence. The 1860s and 70s were the height of violence between the US military and the indigenous plains peoples, and fossil prospectors very rarely actually got permission from the indigenous folks before they broke open their land and took out all of their natural history. More often they just showed up, protected by US forts or even entire military escorts. We don't talk about this much on the show, or in general, but most of the earth that these workers were breaking open to get these bones was only accessible to them because the indigenous people had been forcibly removed from it. The history of paleontology is in many ways a history of scientific imperialism, people going out into the rest of the world, bringing back these fantastic specimens and concentrating them in institutions in the eastern United States and Western Europe. But whatever the social and political reasons for the fossils to be moved this far, they were being moved this far, and workers had to come up with, largely through trial and error, ways of holding them together across the trip. It had to be done quickly and cheaply in the field, using the materials that they had on hand. At first, it mostly consisted of just putting the specimens in sacks, tying them to a horse or loading them in a wagon, and hoping for the best. And I'm going to open one of these and show you why that might not work out. So, relying on the rock to hold your specimen together only gets you so far, because the rock will break apart in transit. And unlike this toy, bones were not made of particularly more robust material than the matrix surrounding them, which meant that by the time they got back east, the whole thing would just be crumbly mess, bones and all. Marsh called this transporting fossils in potato fashion. He described his collectors doing the pick, rake, and sack technique, which would be to take a pick, pry it under the fossil to get it out of the ground, and then rake the remains into a bag to transport it. It is not anywhere close to what you would want if your goal is to have the fossil intact at the end of it. Now, why would workers rely on gunny sacks and prairie grass? Well, possibly they just didn't intuit that fossils were so fragile. You're holding it, it's a rock. It seems like it's gonna hold together on its own pretty well. It's possible that, until they realized, oh, if the fossil breaks apart, I don't get paid, that they weren't incentivized to worry about this. It's also possible that they knew full well that this wasn't gonna work, but it was all they could do. They didn't have better materials available. I'm doing a bit of conjecture here because while our sources for Europe are extremely limited, our sources for America are not much better until the very tail end of this period, when the dinosaur rush is winding down. One British worker, YDAW, observed, "The results of the expeditions, their faunal lists, and the taxonomic descriptions and revised classifications are self-evident in any paleontology library, but the methods and techniques employed in the laboratory to obtain information are seldom clear and sometimes not even mentioned. Vertebrate paleontology must be one of the few sciences where the techniques used to establish the facts appear to be of little consequence. Fortunately for us, prospectors did write to their employers, and because, these weren't emails, we hadn't invented that yet, the paper letters survive, and we have some information about what they were doing. And so the advice they were getting from the guys back east feels like the kind of advice that you only give if you've learned the hard way that it needs to be given. In 1868, Cope wrote to his workers that were digging up an Elasmosaurus and asked, which end is the head on? No, he didn't ask that. He wanted them to not over-prepare the specimen. That is, preparation is the removal of the matrix. He wanted them to leave a rock around the bone so that it would hold together. He told them to pack it in such a way that it would avoid friction or breakage, and to use plenty of hay or other packing material, and not to make the crate too large, both so that the specimen wouldn't wobble around all over the place, and also so that the crate just wouldn't break under the strain. In 1875, Marsh, who was no longer participating in fieldwork by that point, went into a little more detail than Cope. He said that you need to pack the fossils on site. Do not bring them to camp first, they will break. Wrap them separately in paper, in sacks with cotton and twine. If you have teeth, put those in cigar boxes or empty food tins, also packed with cotton. And he emphasizes preserving or recording how the fossils originally lay in the ground with the air of somebody who never checks their luggage when they fly. He wants them to label the locality, formation, collector, and date. He wants them to keep elements that they found together when they pack them. Which sounds intuitive to us, but apparently this had to be said. He says to keep the bones of each toe together, separated from other toes. If there's one specimen that's in multiple sacks, tie the sacks together so that part of the specimen doesn't get separated. And again, label the sacks. Better yet, just have the whole specimen still in the rock you found it in and send the whole slab of rock. He says it's better to send 100 pounds of rock than to leave tool marks on a good specimen. Interestingly, he specifies that small specimens, like birds, are especially valuable compared to, the large impressive bones, which makes sense, those are the rarer ones. He emphasizes that, missing pieces, even if a skull is missing a tooth, that can really lessen the value. I like that he's relating it all back to, how much can I pay for this? He also specifies that if they do need to break a bone to get it out, they should first diagram or draw the bone as it lies in the ground and pack that diagram in with the pieces. I keep laughing because so many of these are just obviously he got a crate and was like, why didn't they put this in there? Or why is this in this other place? And it's just coming through. Now, as you may notice, we are still relying on the rock and the bone, or whatever else the fossil is, to hold themselves together, which seems to be working okay. Like that Elasmosaurus that Cope was so worried about apparently could have been packed better, but it did hold together across 100 miles of wagon journey to get to the railhead, and then I don't even know how far by train. But because field workers didn't have access to better packing materials than just hay and burlap and cotton, they had to innovate ways to try to get the matrix and the fossil to stick together. Literally. We know from surviving correspondences as well as biographies of some of these guys that workers were experimenting with hardening, what we now call consolidation. They would saturate the rock and the fossil with glues and try to get the mass to just hold together better as they transported it. Initially, workers used animal and vegetable glues. Gum water was pretty popular. This was gum arabic or acacia gum spread onto the matrix and the bone to soak into it. This worked well enough, but it was kind of brittle, and if the specimen moved from a very dry environment to a very humid environment, as they did, it would lose some of its stickiness and not work so well. In the early 20th century, workers started using shellac. I didn't know this, but it's called that because it's secreted by the female lac bug. This comes as flakes that you dissolve in alcohol. It penetrates a lot better than gum water did, and it doesn't have the humidity problem. In addition to just gluing stuff together, they would hold it together structurally with bandaging or splinting. This is extremely similar to setting a broken bone, or a a living broken bone, you know, like when you break your arm. They would have strips of cloth or paper that had been soaked in some kind of cement and then wrapped around both the specimen and the matrix. These were supported by wood planks or by iron rods like Davies's mammoth, and there was even experimentation with encasement, where you have a huge hard shell around the entire bandaged specimen, which eventually resulted in today's modern plaster jackets. There was one worker in the 1870s of New Mexico who was experimenting with a plastic gumbo, which meant a clayey mud that he would suspend the fossils in. And that's the closest historical equivalent we could find to the way this toy does it, where it's just this sort of fine mud with the bones inside it. Though Baldwin, unlike this toy, was using hand-carved wooden cradles, so even he recognized that you needed to have the container match the shape of the specimen, not just put them in a rectangular case. Around the same time, in the Kansas Badlands, Sternberg and Cope had some very brittle fossils, and their solution was to boil their rice until it formed a paste, and then soak flour sacks, cotton cloth, and burlap in that, and bandage the fossils with that. They explicitly compare this process to bandaging a broken bone. There was another worker, Williston, who was using strips of paper soaked in flour paste, and he would have been familiar with the process of plastering a cast from the American Civil War, which is, we think, why some people attribute the plaster jacketing process to Williston, but he said that no, that wasn't me. That might have been Arthur Lakes. He wrote in a letter to Marsh about his process for protecting a bone with plaster of Paris so that he could hammer the rock around it without damaging it. And being Lakes, he made a watercolor of the process. That might be, like, even if he didn't come up with the plaster of Paris thing, his painting might be the earliest depiction of this technique, which is notable of itself. We're giving this many examples because we want to emphasize this wasn't any kind of linear progression. This was all happening around 1868 through 70. Even with all the constraints, it is kind of surprising that gypsum plaster, better known as plaster of Paris, didn't become the standard sooner than it did. Like, it was already well known at the time. It had been used in architectural decorations, both in and outside of buildings, really anywhere that you couldn't use lime plaster for years. Art museums used it as the medium for replicas of sculptures. Natural history institutions used it for replicas of bones or to fill in the parts of a bone you don't have, which is what we still do. There was a fellow named Henry Ward who was selling replica bones to naturalists in America around this time. And that was in the 1860s, which is before the big dinosaur rush happened. But even once plaster of Paris was known to have the properties that they wanted, it wasn't universally adopted. Partially this might have been financial, like being able to actually get the stuff. Marsh was particularly bad about funding his expeditions up front, or even paying at all. There's a number of letters from Williston to Marsh complaining about non-payment, and Williston was forced to compromise the materials he was using due to his budget. But Cope and Marsh being kind of bad to work for was also sort of indirectly helpful because it meant that collectors were jumping from guy to guy and were bringing their experience and expertise with them. So there was a lot of cross-pollination happening instead of, you know, individuals keeping their trade secrets, which is what you want in science. The next phase of our story is from the late 1890s to the early 1910s. It's roughly coincident with the second dinosaur rush. This is when we see the institutionalization of paleontology and the codification of preparation and collection workflows. Where in the previous phase we had interested individuals who wanted scientifically significant specimens, now it's these big philanthropy-funded museums who want impressive displays to show off, you know, the beneficence of their benefactors. We had a large volume of specimens flowing into these institutions, more than they could actually prepare. So you had these storage vaults full of bones rotting in their jackets because you don't have enough preparators. So they trained a bunch more preparators, and when you're training that many people, you have to write some of it down. So training materials survive. Can't show off your donor's wealth if it all crumbled to rubble before anybody could work on it. This is when we start to see specializations in the lab, though obviously people did wear multiple hats. The sort of standard career was to go out to the field during the summer, then come back to the lab in the winter to prepare what you had found, which has the added benefit that you can get paid year-round. But skilled preparators were much sought after, so you still saw some of that hopping around from earlier, but instead of scientist to scientist, it's from institution to institution. So, you know, the Carnegie, Field, National, and American museums all had cross-pollination of ideas because it was the same people going from job to job. One result of this flurry of professionalization is that trade skills that had been passed down by word of mouth got codified into training manuals. Our best examples are by Schuchert from the National Museum, now the Smithsonian, and Herman from the American Museum. Schuchert wrote an 1895 manual for both serious beginner paleontologists as well as hobbyists. And I think the advice here was for the latter group, where he says, if you come across a very large and impressive specimen, cover it up and call a museum. Whereas Herman, writing in 1908 and 9, was approaching the topic from his perspective, which was as a preparator. There's a lot of detail about what goes into mounting and prepping a specimen for display, and a lot of the advice for collection amounts to, please don't make our job any harder. Schuchert goes into detail about everything from what to wear and carry, to how to go about searching, to how to split rock with a sledge. Both writers caution against removing bones piece by piece. They emphasize that if you can, you should remove the whole slab of rock with the specimen still embedded. If you can't, you have to harden the bones. Schuchert still recommends gum water, but by the time that Herman is writing, he clearly prefers shellac. He says that brown shellac is materially better, but recommends white if the bone is white, because, you know, you gotta keep it pretty for display. Both say you should cover the specimen with thin oiled paper. Herman actually says you should glue it to the specimen. You brush on some shellac and then lay the paper down and brush the paper with water so that it conforms. They say to then bandage the specimen, you would use strips of burlap or muslin dipped in a flour paste. They actually specify that you should add corrosive sublimate, which will both prevent the flour from fermenting and poison any mice that try to eat it, which is slightly sad. For large bones, they suggest that you should do a layer of muslin and then a layer of burlap over top, but even better would be to have a paper layer around the flour bandage and then a layer of Plaster of Paris. The Plaster of Paris layer could take the form of like an entire case. Like you would lay sticks or even iron rods across the specimen and then pack or even pour plaster into it to form one congealed shell. Then once you had a solid mass several inches thick, then you could undermine the specimen and get it out of the ground. Schuchert still recommends cigar boxes and cotton for small and delicate fossils. He even goes into like the different sizes of boxes or cartons that would work for different sizes of specimens. For invertebrates, you'd want soap, starch, or canned fruit boxes. A little bit bigger than that, you'd want hardware or stove boxes. Bigger than that, you have to make custom crates. It seems like Herman still had specimens arriving unlabeled or at least poorly labeled, because he specifies that if you're packing a specimen that's in multiple blocks, you should include a diagram showing how the blocks lay before you took them out of the ground. He also says that when you're packing crates, you need to leave plenty of space in between your specimens and pack that space in with hay or straw or excelsior, which I did not know. That is a term in America for wood wool, for shavings. I do not know why. Schuchert, for his part, includes a field label template that includes number, label, list of contents, localities, and horizon. Herman also has some instructions for unpacking, which imply to me that he must have had an incident, because he says you need to keep elements that were packed together once they're unpacked, and you need to keep the labels with the specimen. Interestingly, according to Herman, they'd also use a Plaster of Paris jacket in the lab. Once they get the field jacket off and prepare the specimen, repair it, shellac what they could, they would put down a layer of paraffin paper or even just a layer of lard oil to separate it from the Plaster of Paris layer, which then allowed them to flip it over and prepare the other side without damaging what they'd already worked on. They would also use a mixture of plaster and gum to repair broken bones in the lab. This had the advantage that it was cheap, quick to produce, dried quickly, and held indefinitely. So again, field techniques and lab techniques could be surprisingly similar. The next big push to codify methods was in the interwar years, when we had 4 big textbooks published. 2 were in German, of course, 1 was in Russian, but 1 was in English. This was 1937's Methods in Paleontology. Like Herman, the authors, Camp and Hanna, were aiming their book at novice preparators. They knew that if you are trying to prepare and mount these specimens, you do need to know something about the method by which they are collected and, why they are arriving in the condition that they are. Camp and Hanna record some field methods that appear to be pretty similar to what we saw at the turn of the 20th century, except they record details that we had never gotten before, or at least not that we could find written down. This is the first record we found of the method for forming a pedestal, where you excavate all around your specimen, leaving plenty of room around the bones, and create like a shelf of overhanging rock, which you then wrap your plaster jacket all the way around to create a cap, so that the whole thing holds itself together when you go to excavate under it and flip it. We got some more details about consolidation. They emphasize that the specimen absolutely must be dry for the consolidant to work. If it just won't, you can coat it in beeswax. I don't actually know how that helps, but that's what they said. We're starting to see synthetic consolidants, including celluloid and something called Dural, which appears to be a trade name. Once the specimen is dry, you wet strips of newspaper and lay them over top of the specimen, or if your specimen is particularly fragile or flaky, you can use tissue paper soaked in gum water. In both cases, the point is to create a separation layer between your fossils and the matrix and the plaster that you're going to be layering over it so that they don't stick together. There's a somewhat amusing detail. They point out that you can make plaster of Paris in the field if you have gypsum handy and an oven, but it's not really worth doing because in this country, plaster of Paris may be obtained for 1.5 cents a pound. We also got details on the actual moment-to-moment technique of bandaging that we hadn't gotten before. Like how wide and long should your strips of burlap be? How do you actually mix plaster and get it to adhere to your strips? We got the first written example we could find of a collar, a ring of bandaging around the base of the specimen, which ensures that the plaster cap doesn't slip off. We got details on how to excavate a capped, dried specimen, one method being to dig a series of tiny tunnels and then break the pedestal without getting too close to the bone. We're referencing this one textbook a lot because it's the one we can read, but there's also obviously other textbooks in other languages, as well as internal university documents or publications relating to specific projects and the methods that they used in their situation. But methods stayed remarkably consistent. The main change was to the materials. After World War II, instead of wax paper or muslin, we started to see moistened paper towel and then aluminum foil. We saw several iterations of adhesives. Elmer's glue and Duco cement gave way to polyvinyls, epoxies, and cyanoacrylates. One material that's still in use is good old plaster of Paris. Kind of a if it ain't broke, don't fix it situation. Workers have tried alternatives, but plaster of Paris has a balance of attributes and consistency of performance that alternatives tend to lack. Why do I keep specifying plaster of Paris? Well, a plaster is really any cementing material. A plaster can be clay, lime, a vegetable starch like flour. It's anything that you mix with water and then apply as a paste, which then hardens. Plaster of Paris is a gypsum plaster, hence the name. France has a lot of gypsum. The process by which it works is that we're sort of tricking the gypsum rock into reforming in the shape we need it to be in. You get it by heating gypsum in a kiln to 120 to 180 degrees Celsius, which dehydrates it. That turns it into calcium sulfate hemihydrate. If you mix that powder with water and let it dry, it turns back into gypsum. Plaster of Paris generally doesn't shrink or crack once set. That's why it's so useful for mold making. It will retain the original size of whatever it was shaped around. If you ever had braces, when they made the molds of your teeth, they probably used plaster. This is because it wants to expand in volume as it turns itself back into gypsum, so it'll work itself into every crack and crevice of whatever it's applied to. That same advantage transfers well to keeping things immobile. If you've wrapped an object in plaster, it's going to shrink enough that nothing will rattle around, but not so much that it starts to damage what it's encasing. And because it matches the shape of whatever you've applied it to, there's less chance of pressure points that are going to apply a shock to what's inside it. You can't be too rough with it. You don't want to like toss it around, but it'll take the physical shock of, you know, being in the bed of a truck or whatever. While it's more than 1.5 cents a pound, it is still one of the cheaper building materials you can get, and it's readily available basically anywhere in the country. And as much as we portray this as, you know, over the years the work is getting more and more systematized, there's always going to be room for improvisation because conditions in the field are not going to match the conditions in your books. We found a talk from 2008 where they were dealing with this really crumbly, sandy matrix. They had to devise a way to prop up the specimen so that they could jacket it from underneath as they were undercutting it without having the sand sift out. And that was just to hold everything together long enough to flip it and then remove that temporary stuff and jacket that side properly. And they were still using Plaster of Paris. We seem to be at the point where Plaster of Paris will be adapted to the situation rather than trying to find some new material. As for how workers today protect their stuff, we thought it would be better to show than to tell, so we went to go visit some active dig sites out west.
Just in this immediate pit, more than 2,500 bones came out of here. Every single one of those bones has been from a Diplodocus, so it's a really special site, and we've been working it for 4 or 5 years now, so we've gotten that total at least up to 3,000 by now. There's just bones everywhere, bones on top of bones. There have been, I don't know, a couple dozen predator teeth in there, probably Allosaurus, but for the most part, this is a pit of teenage Diplodocus.
We are here in the Bighorn Basin. We have been at a couple of sites. Right now we're at Mother's Day Quarry with Elevation Science, who have been really cool and have allowed us to hover around watching them fossil prospect. It's pretty interesting. They have basically 3 types of jacketing that they'll use based on the size and fragmentary nature of a specimen. At the low end, Dan walked me through how to do a foil pack, which is the equivalent of the historical process of just putting it in cotton and then putting it in a cigar box.
So this pedestal would have almost been ready for jacketing when we probably did this last year. So it had already been undercut underneath. That lip was there, so somebody had already attached the winter jacket underneath that lip. And that's kind of what killed us here. Yeah, I think we might be able to piece these together. It's all about solving problems on the fly.
First, he got a piece of cardboard down so that could support the specimen. He arranged the pieces as best he could based on how they fell off of the specimen in the rock.
Under normal circumstances, I would label this and take scale photos with a north arrow before it ever came out of the ground. That's what I would do. However, because we're at this point where we're well past that, we're just going to go kind of straight to putting it in a foil pack. Hey, looky there, it's kind of coming together. There, that magic click that Jason Poole likes to talk about. I think it looks pretty good. So these were kind of associated elsewhere. But that one actually went back together pretty well. Good. That's what you call making the best out of a bad situation.
It turned out that it was actually coming together pretty well, so he wound up consolidating it with some acetone-based glue, then wrapped that in some paper towel to help cushion it, and wrapped that whole thing in a pretty tight, structurally supportive layer of tinfoil.
And let it dry, let it sit. But now at least it makes me feel a little better. Alright, we'll do this, and we kind of want to conform it as much as possible. And then I'm going to take paper over once, or tinfoil over once, and just conform it as best I can Our lab manager taught me how to do this last year. I fell in love with the method because it's just, I don't know why, but it's very soothing to pack something kind of like this. Don't ask me why, just in my head it says, oh, this is fun. But it's like wrapping a great big burrito. And so I generally do one over and then fold one end down and then bring the other end back, do the same thing. But the biggest kicker with it is that you have to make sure basically the whole time that you're really pressing down and conforming the foil to the fossil as best as possible. In this case, since there's a little paper towel in the way, that may be a little bit more subjective in terms of how far we can actually conform it. But if at all possible, we really want to make it nice and tight. And at the end of the day, you'll almost be able to tell what a foil pack is, what's inside it, based on the shape alone. With paper towels, it's a little more difficult, but it deserves some nice protection too. The next round. Bring it down. That's more or less it in terms of what actually needs packed. And there you kind of have it. There's your foil pack. So now what we'll do is I'll do a belt around on each side, and then I'll try and do a lengthwise one just to help hold the foil in place and stop anything from moving around. The less it moves, the better.
Then over top of that goes the color-coded tape that says which site it's from and all of its labels. Antonio walked me through actually participating in the top jacketing of a slightly larger specimen, but not so large that we need to deal with pre-mixed plaster of Paris. Instead, we used these bandages, essentially. They're the same thing that you would use to plaster a cast on a broken bone on a living person.
Before we can even think about jacketing, we have to think about getting that element, whatever it is, be it a rib, a femur, a humerus, that has to be trenched around, and that's what you can see all along this. One of our participants has actually dug all the way around this element so that when we flip it, we're not flipping a humongous chunk of rock with it. We're just flipping a little bit of rock and the fossil that we want to find.
Okay.
So to do that, we're gonna need to take one of these trowels,
right.
and I'm gonna have you come up from this side,
right.
and just kind of stick it underneath the tin foil.
Oh, right underneath?
Sort of right underneath. I'm going a little bit, maybe like a half an inch underneath.
All right.
And we want to loosen it.
Okay.
And it is pretty crumbly.
Yeah.
So just make sure that you're loosening all the way around it so that when we flip it, we can hopefully get all of it flipped together.
Okay.
All right, so that's good for loosening it.
All right.
That way, when we finish the top jacket on this, we can flip it right out.
Gotcha.
So I'm gonna put the trowels over here.
Is there like a rule of thumb for like how much material you leave around the element? Because I noticed on some of these you have less than others.
So the rule of thumb that I usually do is if there's an element and the element sits kind of right here in the center of this tin foil, I usually do between 2 or 4 fingers away. That's where you start the trench.
Okay.
And then you usually go like 4 or 5 inches down from where you think the bottom of the bone is.
Where you think, right, because you obviously don't know.
You can't see underneath it. So we want to make sure that we've exposed both ends of it so we can kind of see how thick it is. And then once we get that sort of judgment on it, we can go however far down we need to go to get all of the fossil in the jacket.
I see.
So what we're going to do right now is I'm going to fill up this little tub with water, and I want just a little bit of water. You don't want too much. We've got JJs here, which, well, we call them JJs. They're
I noticed.
Gypsona brand, and it's stuff that people use for medical grade casts.
Okay.
So
cool.
in this case, the plaster is already in the material, as opposed to when you're jacketing something larger, it will be burlap strips that we then stream through Plaster of Paris mixture and then put that on the aluminum foil of the larger elements. I'm just gonna rip this, and I'm gonna have you kind of put it all the way around. So start at where the bottom of the tin foil is.
Okay.
And just kind of get it situated. I'm gonna rip it right here because it seems to be a little bit challenging to get it all the way around.
Okay.
And then I'm gonna rip another strip, and you can kind of start from that really thin edge up there, or that really shallow trench up there.
All right.
And give it a good lip.
Okay. And are we primarily sticking it to the foil or to the? It's not going to stick to the rock.
Yeah, it's not going to really stick to the rock, unfortunately. Duct tape would probably work pretty well too, but this is the kind of color tape that we use for this site. So we're going to go around one more time, just so we have a pretty pronounced green lip there.
All right.
And this will also just help with the structural integrity of this jacket.
I gotcha.
Really, it's a matter of keeping things in place. So anything that you can use, be it the tin foil, the plaster, or the tape, to keep that element from shifting around as we transport it, that's what we want to be. That's what we want to be doing.
I noticed. So, my knowledge of this process is mostly like people writing in the 1920s. You're using aluminum foil.
Yes.
Which they didn't have.
Correct.
What's the advantage here?
So the advantage of the aluminum foil, and some people before using aluminum foil would pack things with paper or with tissue, and the disadvantage of using stuff like that is mold. So you can get moldy jackets. That's a thing that'll happen. And so what we try and do is we try and use stuff that we have that won't create that sort of health and safety hazard for our preparators at the lab.
Yeah.
Because that's obviously a huge issue. When we have people opening these jackets, we want to make sure they're not inhaling a bunch of black mold.
Yeah. That is not something I had considered.
Yeah, right? It's something that you wouldn't consider unless you really kind of get into the nitty-gritty of the field, because obviously we're doing science, but we're doing science in the elements. So there's not a whole lot of control for all the variables. So we want to control them as much as possible.
Right.
All right, so now that we've got that kind of taped down, I'm gonna start streaming these through.
Okay.
And like we did with the tape, we're gonna create this sort of lip all the way around.
All right.
And then we're gonna go cross hatch over.
Okay.
That'll be one layer. And then we're gonna do 2 more layers after that with this.
And again, I assume we're sticking to the foil and the tape, not trying to apply plaster to rock.
Correct,
Gotcha.
yes. All right, so I'll just hand stuff off to you once it's been wet.
Alrighty.
And just try and make sure that it stays somewhat
Not twisted.
not twisted, yep. Nice job. Wow, you're a natural.
Oh dear. Now I'll become overconfident.
All right. And I'll let you take care of all the little nooks and crannies.
Okay.
Looks like you got a pretty good setup there. Here's another strip. Yeah, and it's difficult with a kind of tight trench that we have around this element to get it all the way down to where it needs to be.
I got skinny fingers.
Perfect, that's what we need then. Right tools for the right job.
Wow, you look at the dry strip and it doesn't look like a lot of plaster, but then it gets on there and oh wow, that's...
Yeah, it's really in there.
Now getting it into the crannies is, I assume air pockets are bad.
Yes, air pockets are our enemy. We don't want to have that many spaces where rock could tumble out or fill that space. So when this dries, we want it to dry in all those nooks and crannies so it holds everything in place. And this one will go kind of across the top.
Okay.
So you're going to start from the top up here, and I'm going to press it down onto the foil.
All right.
And then you're going to come over here, and obviously you have a little bit of length out down here, so you're going to flip it up and back over. Perfect.
It does wind up looking a lot like a cast on a broken arm.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the theory behind it, is that just like a broken arm doesn't need to move, we don't want these fossils to move. We want them to stay kind of in the place that they were when we uncovered them, so that when they're in the lab, they can get all that sort of shape data from them.
I didn't even ask you where to put this one.
You just went right ahead. Perfect.
Okay.
That's good. Yeah, so the next one that I'm going to have you do is going to be kind of all the way, like, sort of at a 45-degree angle across it.
Okay.
That way we can create some of that structural integrity.
Oh, okay, so you want them sort of like a plywood.
Exactly, yeah,
going in
yeah.
different
So that one will
directions.
go, you can start it right down here.
Okay.
And then if you need to fold it in, you can.
All right.
And I'll fold that up for you.
Cool.
And then you can fold that edge up as well if you see fit.
I can see why you don't wear gloves for this.
Yeah, it kind of gets all over the place. And then this one, I'm going to have you do opposite of that one you just did. So kind of, yep, perfect.
Fold it up.
Fold it up into the rest of the jacket. And then you can fold that edge up over here to give that a little bit more structural integrity as well.
Cool, cool.
Perfect.
Oh my goodness. There we go. There we go.
Great. I'll get the next one ready for you. This one will be another lip piece, so it'll go around on your side again.
Okay.
Sorry, my hand was in the way.
Oh, that's perfectly up. Oh.
You're all good, all good. That's great.
So if we... It seems like we don't want too many folds, or what do you call them, wrinkles.
Yes, the wrinkles are bad. The folds are okay, because the folds will kind of create more structure, I guess, for the jacket itself. The wrinkles don't add much to the structural integrity. So
Gotcha.
we want the surface area of these strips to kind of be fully used up. All right, and we're gonna come around this end is this side, so I'll let you do that again. And we have a couple more strips, so we're almost done. We're just gonna go cross-hatching again over the top.
Okay.
And then we should be all set with this jacket. Yeah, just make sure that it's hugging all that aluminum foil, that it's kind of pressed up against, like you were saying. No air pockets.
Does it like adhere to the foil, or is it just kind of like once it's sunk into all the crevices, it's not going to move?
I think that's the latter, because it will adhere to the fossil, that's for sure.
I've definitely, when cooking with aluminum foil, I've had stuff stick to it, but I don't know if that applies to Plaster of Paris.
Yeah, no, I think it might. I think it might adhere to some of the tin foil, but that's kind of why the tin foil is there, so that instead of adhering to the fossil and damaging it, we only have adherence to a material that we will maybe reuse or just trash, depending on how stuck to it is.
I've seen in museums they'll put stuff like even on display with the one side of the jacket still on there.
Yes,
because it holds it all together.
Exactly, and that's what we're trying to do. Is we're trying to create something that's like a cradle for the fossil.
Yeah, that's a good word for it. Cradle.
Yeah, that's fine.
You can push that in there.
Oh,
and then
sorry.
You're all good. No, that's perfect. You noticed it and you corrected. So. All right, gonna crosshatch. I would crosshatch over it like that.
All right.
And we have two more strips, so we're just gonna keep doing that cross-hatching so we can kind of get that structural integrity down.
I got some dirt in there.
Yeah, that's all good.
Now earlier, you guys had some stuff that had already been jacketed, or top jacketed, and you were doing the bottom jacket where you had to flip it first.
Correct.
So we filmed what you were doing, but I don't know if we heard any of the explanations. We heard that you always have to label, what is this?
Yes.
Where did we find it? What even site is it?
Correct.
When did we get it? That's like reading about the historical process. They didn't always write that stuff down. And you get some letters written that are have the tone of, I cannot use this because you didn't tell me what you were giving me.
Yes. So we try and collect as much data as possible. Which way was the fossil oriented in the rock? Which way was north in relation to the fossil? That data really provides the preparator and then the researcher with stuff that they can use to say stuff about the site and about the preservation of that fossil itself.
Right. That makes sense. That makes sense.
So you did it.
Hey.
You jacketed a fossil. Congratulations. This is perfect. I'm just going to smooth out some of the ridges, but you really got in there, so I really appreciate that.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thank you for coming along.
Now, allegedly, we've done this one perfectly, but you mentioned earlier that some things can go wrong with the curing process?
Correct.
Okay.
So even though we did a really good job on this jacket, there's still potentiality for it to fail, is what we say in the field. So failure of a jacket basically means that the plaster of Paris hasn't completely cured over a long period of time. Usually we leave it out here for about 24 hours, come back and check on the status of it. Anything from high humidity to a recent rain event, any moisture getting to that jacket could potentially cause it to fail. So we really want to make sure, and this is why I've had us jacket a lot of things today in the morning, so that we can really let it sit in the sun over a long period of the day. That way this can bake for a while, it can set, it can cure, and then we can be ready to, when it's cured, flip it out and do the bottom jacket like we did on 2 other elements this morning.
And how do you tell that a jacket has failed? Like, is it gonna like actually crack, or does it just...
You know, there's a bunch of different ways that it can fail. I don't know per se if it will crack, but the way that I've seen jackets fail is that they remain soggy. So if you have...
It's the consistency.
Correct. So if you have plaster of Paris and you're applying it to the jacket and then you come back after 24 hours and it's still kind of got that like goopy plaster of Paris, not quite set feel to it. You can even like smear it with your finger. If that happens, then you know that the jacket has failed. So we have a jacket in this quarry that's failed recently, so we're gonna have to cut all that away and then reapply the entire burlap and plaster process to it.
Moving up a size class, we also got to watch Skye top jacket I believe it was part of a scapula of a camarasaur. It's largely the same process as doing it with the little JJs, just you're racing the clock a little bit because the plaster will start to set up as soon as you mix it.
So some stuff that we have to think about with bigger fossils more than anything is stability. So stuff like this, especially here in fossil flats, tends to be a little bit more fragmentary. And you also have to think about the long game. So when you have something like this, you have to think about, okay, how are we going to flip it? When are we going to flip it? And where are the weak points? So we really want to focus on structure for jackets like this because they can fail pretty easily without that structure. Because with stuff like JJs, those are much less likely to fail.
I was surprised by the consistency that the plaster had. I didn't realize it was actually the thickness of like pancake batter once you start working with it, and it only gets thicker as you progress. Just like with the little ones, they tried to have a band around the bottom of the top jacket, as well as crisscrossing structural strips all across the top. And at every step, it was important, both for the giant specimens and for the little ones, to have both the foil and the bandages not leaving any air gaps, to have it really conforming to the shape of the fossil and the matrix underneath it, because you really don't want anything to shake loose or break loose.
So we typically do them in long strips versus kind of medium-sized strips like these, depending on where we want to put them. So what we'll do next is pick up where Sophia left off. Yeah, and really bring it to the bottom. Give it a good wrap around. And it's all right if we get a little dirt in the plaster. It gives character. We'll start here at the end. And this is where we start to crisscross.
Okay.
So it gives this kind of lattice structure, and it just makes it a bit more solid. And you may notice that we're kind of running our hands over it when we put it on.
Right.
And that is because we want the jacket to be as smooth as possible. We don't want any sharp edges, because if there are any sharp edges, that becomes a bit of a hazard. So when it dries, it's pretty hard and pretty sharp. So when one of us or someone in the lab picks it up, they can cut themselves pretty badly. You don't want it to be too thick, because we don't want to be carrying, you know, a 1,000-pound jacket out of here. And we also don't want to make it too thick, because the preparators are the ones that have to open it. So we don't want to make their jobs any harder than they have to be.
My favorite part of the large specimen jacketing was actually something that I'd seen like vague references to a bandaging step and a separate plastering step, and I didn't understand what they meant by that, because, you know, the bandages are plaster, obviously. Skye just started taking handfuls of plaster and glooping them, she called it. Just glooped onto the outside of the jacket to cradle it, to give it an extra layer around all of the burlap bandages.
This just really helps smooth it out, gets a lot of extra protection on there, as well as smoothing out a lot of those hard edges. So the kind of smoothness we're looking for is
like that one over there.
Yeah, kind of almost porcelain.
Almost.
Almost. Smooth as a baby's bottom. And we want to fill in any crevices that we see. We don't want any divots. So we're trying to alleviate any weak points that we can see.
The gloop phase also serves a protective function for people working with the bone. The burlap, once it's dried, once the plaster has cured, actually can be quite sandpapery. You can get rug burn from it, and we don't want to hurt anybody. We don't want to get blood on the specimens. So the gloop layer provides a really nice, smooth, even surface that nobody's going to get hurt by.
We'll try to do this as early in the day as we can. And then if it's not completely cured by morning, then usually the sun the next day will kind of help bake it. And then typically by the second day, we can start to trench underneath it and then kind of get rid of the rock underneath it. And then what we do is we'll flip it.
Yep.
So you kind of need a team of people for that.
Right.
So you'll have somebody on one side kind of trying to catch it, and then you'll have some people over here that have their hands underneath trying to catch anything that might fall out. And then you go on 3, 1, 2, 3, and you have to go really, really fast, so less stuff will fall out. So I think this is as far as we're gonna get with this guy. And you can see that we have quite a bit of aftermath on ourselves, but that's part of the fun.
And it was pretty cool. We got to see some specimens getting taken out of the quarry, which, you know, they've been sitting essentially in the same spot for 150 million years, and we just happened to be here when they picked it up and took it elsewhere. So that's field jacketing. Another reminder of how young this science is, that some of the methods and a lot of the materials that the earliest pioneers were using are still in use. However, even over this relatively brief 200 years, there's a surprising amount of historical scholarship that you need to be able to piece this story together. There's a dearth of secondary sources. Liz and I couldn't actually find anybody writing about the history of this before the last 20, 30 years. Maybe this is another growing pain for the science, that somebody has to go through and collate and compile what previous generations had learned by word of mouth or hands-on. But I hope this wasn't too niche of a topic for you all. I hope it was as nice for you to see an actual excavation going on as it was for us to visit one. I want to thank you for watching Your Dinosaurs Are Wrong, and I want to thank Elevation Science again for being so hospitable to us, and we'll see you next time. We would like to extend a special thank you to these individuals who have gone above and beyond to support this show. We could not have done it without you. Thank you.